Okay, hi everyone. I wanted to go over this concept because I noticed that new students to accounting struggle sometimes with understanding what liabilities are. So here's a multiple choice question. Which of the following are liabilities that would be reflected within a company's balance sheet? Is it A, revenues, B, expenses, C, obligations, or D, equity? All right. Well, let's explore each of these to see if we can answer this question, and this won't take very long. All right, so what you see on the screen now is the definition of revenues, and this comes from the Accounting Coach. I've got the web location where I found this. And what the Accounting Coach tells us is that revenue represents fees earned from providing services and the amounts of merchandise sold. Okay? And under the accrual basis of accounting, revenues are recorded at the time of delivery of the services, even if the cash is not received. So in other words, we record revenue when it is earned. Now, I like to think of revenues as being the principal operation that a profit-seeking business is attempting. Right? It wants to sell something or provide a service. It wants to generate inflows of cash or maybe some other assets. That's the main objective that the profit-seeking business wants. And obviously, it wants its revenues to be worth more than its expenses, so that when we subtract expenses from revenues, we would have net income rather than a net loss. So that brings us to the next area, which is expenses. Well, what are expenses? Well, the Accounting Coach tells us they're costs that are matched to the revenues on the income statement. And he uses an example that cost of goods sold is an expense, just as insurance expense would be, and wages expense, and advertising expense. So I think of expenses as those sacrifices or cash outflows or some kind of outflows. That's why I like to think of them as sacrifices that a business has to incur in the hopes of generating revenues. Okay? And later on we learned that with accounting, we try to match the expenses to the revenues when we generate net income. It's not the other way around. We record revenues when they're earned, and then we match the expenses to them to determine net income for that particular accounting period. All right, so let's look back at that question again. So I'll slide back up here. Which of the following are liabilities that would be reflected in the company's balance sheet? Well, we now know it's not revenues. That's what the company is trying to achieve, and that appears on the income statement, and it's not expenses. Those represent sacrifices that have to be incurred in the hopes of generating revenues. And both revenues and expenses appear on a company's income statement rather than the balance sheet. Well, how about obligations? Let's take a look and see what the Accounting Coach says about obligations. Well, he doesn't have a definition of obligations, but look at the definition of liabilities. First word, they're obligations. So we think of liabilities as being obligations. Think of them as the words being essentially the same. So liabilities represent obligations of a company or organization. They represent amounts owed to lenders and suppliers. And they often have the word payable in the account title. It means that liabilities represent something we owe to others. And that clearly is the answer to this multiple choice question. But let's also look at equity before we leave this topic. Okay, equity, according to the Accounting Coach, represents the difference between assets and liabilities, such as stockholders' equity, owner's equity, or in the case of a nonprofit business, equity would be called net assets. Now, I like to think of equity as the residual interest in the assets of the company after the liabilities or the obligations have been satisfied. So I think of it as the residual interest in the assets that really benefit the owners of the organization. Okay? So this was just a very quick explanation to help you understand how to understand why liabilities represent obligations. And I often find that new students to accounting, tend to struggle with this concept. Okay, thanks everyone. I hope you found this helpful.